a murdered medieval queen, a cursed ruby, $100 million shopping spree, a cold CEO husband, and an ex-king trying to literally rip open time to steal back his throne using his wife's blood. This is not a chill premise. Journey of an Ancient Queen is one of those dramas where you read the synopsis and you are like, okay, either this is going to be a train wreck, or I'm about to lose 2 weeks of my life to it. And, honestly, for me it leaned way more toward the second one. If you are new here, I'm the voice behind Jonota News, where we take messy, ambitious dramas and pull them apart like we're in a late-night group chat that never ends. If you enjoy deep-dive drama breakdowns and you like having someone overanalyze your favorite shows for you, feel free to subscribe to Jonota News so you don't miss the next rabbit hole we fall into together. Quick ground rules before we dive into the chaos of this show. I'm going to keep this at a kind of middle level for spoilers. The setup and the big premise twists that are already in the official storyline, I'm going to talk about those openly, so things like the reincarnation, the ruby, the fact that Louis crosses over into the modern world. But I won't walk you point by point through the final resolution or the very last big moves. I'll hint, I'll gesture, but I won't fully ruin the endgame. Journey of an Ancient Queen opens in this medieval world that feels almost mythic. You've got Queen Healy, regal, controlled, carrying herself like someone who has spent her whole life being looked at and judged and still insists on being the sharpest person in any room. And you've got King Louis, her husband, who should be her partner in rule, but the story frames him right from the get-go with this simmering danger. You know that guy who smiles with just his teeth and not his eyes? That's the vibe. The show doesn't waste too much time pretending this is a happy marriage. Underneath the gold crowns and the candlelit banquets, there's this locked-in tension. The way the court scenes are shot, lots of distance, lots of people watching from the sidelines, you feel how performative everything is, how fragile Healy's position is even though she's technically queen. It's like every time she speaks, she's walking a tightrope above a pit full of men who would be very happy to see her fall. Then we get to the betrayal. I like that the drama doesn't play it as a sudden, out-of-nowhere twist. You can sense it building. There are those little moments where Louis touches her shoulder and she tenses, where he corrects her in front of courtiers to put her back in her place, where he tries to dress cruelty up as statecraft. When the murder finally happens, it feels less like a plot twist and more like a horrible inevitability. One of the early scenes that really stuck with me is the way they handle her death. Instead of going for pure shock, the camera stays close to Healy's face. You see the exact second when she realizes Louis isn't just threatening her, he's actually going to do it. There's this micro-expression, hurt, disbelief, then this weird, quiet acceptance that looks a lot like rage that's been buried for years and only now realizes it never had a chance to fully live. The choice to keep the violence mostly off-screen and focus on her eyes instead says a lot about what this show wants to be about, not just the spectacle of betrayal, but what it costs to be the one betrayed. Here's where the story immediately gets interesting. Instead of her death being the end, it's basically the fuse that lights the entire rest of the show. We are introduced to the ruby. In the medieval timeline, it's this object loaded with symbolism, a royal gem, associated with power, legitimacy, maybe even divine right. You see it in Healy's jewelry, in close-ups where it catches candlelight. It's the kind of prop the camera keeps reminding you exists, so your brain goes, okay. This is not just a pretty rock. Something's up. When Healy dies, her blood touches the ruby. The show doesn't over-explain it with some immediate exposition dump about curses and prophecies. Instead, it plays almost like a folktale. Her soul doesn't accept annihilation, it gets anchored, pulled into the future. It's less magic system and more myth logic, and that actually works in the show's favor. You are not sitting there with a notebook trying to map time travel rules in episode 1. You are just watching this woman refuse to be erased. Cut to the modern day. A completely different woman, alive, relatively young, living in a world of glass towers and LED screens, suddenly becomes the new host for Healy's soul. The first time Healy wakes up in the present, it's disorienting in all the right ways. The sound design goes weirdly muffled, everyday noises like hospital machines or traffic outside sound alien. The camera lingers on things we find ordinary but that, through Healy's eyes, look absolutely unreal. A fluorescent ceiling light becomes this cold, blinding sun. And drip looks like bizarre alchemy. What sells that entire transition, though, is the performance. The actress playing this modern woman has to convince us that, literally overnight, the way she inhabits her own face and body has changed. Her posture is different, her gaze becomes heavier, more measured. She looks at her own hands the way Healy looked at her royal jewelry, as symbols of power she didn't choose but is going to weaponize anyway. There's this almost comedic sequence where Healy tries to walk, realizes the clothes are weird, the room is weird, there's a tiny glass rectangle on the bedside table that keeps lighting up and making sounds. The show walks a very fine line here. If they lean too hard into, oh my god, what is this sorcery, a smartphone, it would feel like a parody. Instead, it plays more as tightly controlled panic. She's terrified, but she's too proud to let anyone see that. So she mimics, she studies, she uses that same survival instinct we saw in the court to figure out how to move through this new kind of palace. Just when you think it's going to be a purely fish-out-of-water comedy, the story drops the bomb that this new life comes with 100 million in assets. Not only has Healy been given a second chance at being alive, she's landed in the body of a woman who has money, status, and a whole network of connections in the modern world. Instead of struggling to survive. The question becomes, what is she going to do with that power? The answer, at least at first, is kind of hilarious and also deeply sad. She decides she absolutely has to get the ruby back. That ruby is more than just the object that anchored her soul. It's the last piece of her old life, the thing Louis couldn't destroy. So when she hears it's in some high-end auction house, she basically takes 100 million-sized wrecking ball to her new bank account and smashes through every rational barrier to reclaim it. The way that auction sequence plays out is one of those moments where the show really flexes its ability to do spectacle and character work at the same time. We are in this sleek, almost antiseptic room, full of rich people who treat history like a flex they can buy. The ruby comes out under perfect, clinical lighting, labeled with some bland description. To them it's just, anonymous medieval royal jewel, provenance disputed. To her, it's her life. I love how the camera keeps cutting between the ruby, the auctioneer's mouth, and Healy's hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. You hear people murmuring about investment value and rarity, all that noise, but beneath it is this other sound, Healy's breathing, getting a little faster as the bidding climbs. She keeps pushing the number higher, eyes fixed on the stone, and for a second everyone assumes she's just another spoiled rich woman showing off. They have no idea they're watching someone try to literally buy back her soul. That scene is a perfect microcosm of what this drama is doing. On the surface, it's absurdly extra, she spends a ridiculous amount of money on a single jewel. Underneath, it's about grief that refuses to stay dead. It's about a woman saying, you took my body, my crown, my name, but you are not keeping this. Right after she reclaims the ruby, the show kicks off another thread, modern-day revenge. Because reincarnated or not, Healy is still Healy. She doesn't just want to survive, she wants to settle scores. And the way the show translates that into the modern setting is through this bully character who has made the modern woman's life hell. A lot of dramas use the bully gets their pants trope, but Journey of an Ancient Queen pushes it a little further than I expected. We are not talking about petty school bullying here. This person has power, social, professional, maybe even legal. They've spread rumors, sabotaged careers, probably cornered our protagonist in elevators and meetings and made her feel small. So when Healy fully wakes up in this body and realizes someone's been hunting her in this new life the way men hunted her in the palace, she doesn't decide to meekly rise above it. She decides, I have had enough across 2 centuries. The confrontation is brutal, but in a cathartic way. It's not just physical, though yes, the show absolutely gives Healy a moment to physically fight back, and it is incredibly satisfying. The choreography isn't superhero slick, it's messy, angry, the way real fights between people who genuinely hate each other tend to be. But what makes that scene stick is the look on Healy's face when she corners the bully. There's a moment where she tilts her head and, for a split second, you see the queen again. Not the victim, not the reincarnated confused woman, but the ruler deciding someone's fate. This is where you can feel the audience-pleasing side of the writing kicking in. The show knows exactly what kind of anger a lot of viewers carry into a series like this: anger at unfair bosses, abusers, people who never seem to face consequences. So it gives you a fantasy where a woman who's been powerless in one life walks into a second life with enough ruthlessness to finally bite back. Whether you think the show goes too far or not far enough with that justice is another conversation, but that instinct, that desire to see her fight, feels very real. Here's the twist, though: as satisfying as those revenge beats are, the drama doesn't let that be the whole story. Because the real emotional engine of Journey of an Ancient Queen isn't actually the bully, or even the ruby. It's the marriage. In this new world, Healy finds herself married again. This time, it's not a king on a throne, it's a cold CEO husband running some huge company. The funny thing is, on paper he's a trope we've all seen 1,000 times: emotionally distant, hyper-competent, maybe technically married to his work more than his wife. But because we've already seen Healy get murdered by a man who was supposed to love her, her second-chance marriage hits very differently. The first handful of domestic scenes between them are so tense you could slice them apart. She keeps flinching at casual intimacy, not because this guy is violent, but because history lives in her reflexes. When he reaches for her wrist, there's this tiny delay where you can tell her body is remembering chains, bruises, hands that use touch as a way to hurt. The CEO doesn't understand why his wife, who, from his point of view, is the same person she's always been, is suddenly walking around like a haunted animal. I really appreciated that the show didn't rush this. They let miscommunication simmer, which sounds frustrating, and sometimes it is, but it also feels honest. He tries to maintain their usual chilly, distant dynamic, but Healy keeps breaking the pattern with strange behavior: respect that's a little too formal, a gaze that feels like it's evaluating him as a sovereign, not as a lover. He thinks she's being weird. We know she's essentially testing whether this world's husband is as dangerous as her last one. Just when you start to think, oh no, this is just going to be another cold boss warms up romance glued on top of a reincarnation fantasy, the drama folds in a new angle: she lands a leading role in a movie. And that's where things get intriguingly meta. The idea of a woman who's lived two lives stepping into the role of an actress is genius, honestly. Performance becomes literal and metaphorical at the same time. She's playing a character on screen while also playing the role of normal modern wife in front of her CEO husband, while still carrying the persona of Queen Healy inside. The layers stack up, and if you like dramas that blur the line between performance and identity, this show starts to serve. The audition sequence is a highlight. She walks into this room full of people who think they're experts at pretending to be someone else. They're all nervous, stretching, muttering lines. Healy stands there with this almost bored expression, like, I survived a royal court, you think you can intimidate me? But the second the camera within the show turns on her, she transforms. Her eyes fill with this entire ancient grief and authority, and for a heartbeat it feels like the director and casting team are staring straight through their own time at something much older. It's one of those scenes where the writers are clearly going, yes, she is special, this is a main character, but the actress does enough delicate work with micro-expressions that it actually feels earned. What's interesting is how the show uses her acting career to comment on power dynamics. In the palace, Healy was watched constantly and had to perform obedience. In the modern world, she chooses to be watched for a living and controls what version of herself to put out there. At least, in theory. In practice, the film world is full of its own tyrants, directors with tempers, producers holding purse strings, fans who idolize and then turn on you. So even when she wins by landing that lead role, the series is quietly asking, is this really freedom, or just another costume for the same old cage? If all of that was happening in isolation, Journey of an Ancient Queen would already be a lot. You've got death, reincarnation, revenge, marriage angst, a career arc in the film industry. It's like 5 different dramas in a trench coat. But what takes it from busy to kind of wild is the reveal that Louis has crossed over too. We already know he killed her for power. So when you find out his soul has also made its way into the modern era, your first instinct is horror. This woman cannot catch a break. The show handles his reappearance in a way that leans more thriller than pure melodrama. You see glimpses, a man's silhouette reflected in glass, a pair of eyes lingering too long on her from a crowd, a voice that sounds just a bit too familiar. When it becomes clear that this isn't just some random lookalike, but Louis himself, reborn or transported somehow, the tone shifts. The stakes are suddenly not just emotional, they're metaphysical again. He's not content with living in the present. He's discovered that Healy's blood connected to the ruby might be the key to opening a time rift and pulling the past into the present, or dragging them both back to the era where he once ruled. This is where the show flirts with becoming a full fantasy thriller, and whether that works for you will probably be the make or break point. On the one hand, the time rift stuff is high concept and potentially confusing. On the other hand, it gives a concrete shape to what was already metaphorical, abusers trying to yank survivors back into old patterns, refusing to let them move on. The thing that surprised me, and this might be a slightly contrarian take, is that I actually found Louis more compelling in the modern storyline than I did in the medieval one. In the past, he's fairly straightforward, a king warped by power, deeply patriarchal, convinced his wife is both his property and his rival. In the modern world, stripped of literal kingship but still obsessed with dominance, he becomes almost nastier in a smaller, more insidious way. Watching him try to rebuild his sense of superiority without a literal throne makes him scarier to me than when he had an army at his back. Some people are going to hate that. They're going to say the show humanizes him too much or gives him too much screen time. And I get that. But for me, seeing how his entitlement adapts to a world with corporate boardrooms instead of war councils actually made the thematic core hit harder. Power is adaptive. Abuse is adaptive. If Louis could be reborn in any era, he'd find a way to sit at the head of some table. That's the point. Somewhere in the middle of the series, there's a stretch where the show just luxuriates in its own mess. We are jumping between her marriage, her career, the bullies' fallout, Louis' schemes, and hints about the time rift. On paper, it sounds like a pacing disaster. And to be honest, there were a few episodes where I did feel the length. Scenes start to blur, another tense dinner with the CEO, another almost encounter with Louis, another passive-aggressive meeting with film producers. But then, right when I was thinking, okay, we need to move this along, they drop these little character beats that pull you back in. There's a moment, for instance, where Healy's CEO husband watches her acting on screen for the first time, really watches. Up till then he's just regarded it as a hobby or a career move he's supposed to tolerate. But during one of her intense scenes, he sees a flash of something he's never been allowed to see in their marriage, raw vulnerability, unfiltered pain that isn't packaged in polite silence. The camera stays on his reaction more than on the footage itself. You see confusion, then concern, then this dawning sense that he doesn't actually know his wife at all. That tiny arc, contained in a few seconds of screen time, is more meaningful than a dozen bickering scenes. It's a seed of real intimacy, not, you made me a nice breakfast, intimacy, but you just unknowingly showed me the part of yourself that's still screaming from a centuries-old wound. Moments like that are what kept me hooked through some of the more tangled plotting. Just when the story feels like it's trying to spin too many plates, it'll drop a quiet, human moment that says, no, this is why we are here. This is what it's about. And to be clear, the show is not subtle about its thematic obsessions. It is very, very into the idea of cycles, violence repeating across time, love repeating across time, choices echoing. The ruby is practically its own character. It shows up in close-ups so often you start to anticipate it like a jump scare in a horror movie, except instead of, boo, it's like, remember, fate. The editing leans into that too. There are these transitional cuts where modern Healy's face will line up exactly with a memory of medieval Healy, or the ruby in the auction house will smash cut to the ruby in the royal treasury. It can be a bit on the nose, but honestly, this is the kind of show where subtlety might just get lost anyway. One thing I really want to talk about is how the series uses visuals to differentiate Healy's two lives. The medieval scenes are often bathed in warm, golden light, candles, firelight, sun through stained glass, but the warmth is deceptive. It's the warmth of a gilded cage. The shadows are long, and there's always some dark corner of the frame where a servant or a guard is half visible, listening, judging. Composition-wise, Healy is usually placed off-center in those shots, like she's never quite the one with full control, even when she's literally seated on a throne. Contrast that with the modern world, where everything is sharp, clean, a little too bright. Glass and steel, reflections everywhere. Here, the lighting is cooler, but the frames are often more symmetrical when Healy appears. She steps into boardrooms and auditions and high-rise apartments, and, even when she's out of her depth, the camera frequently puts her dead center, giving her a visual solidity she never had in the palace. The past is warm but treacherous, the present is cold but full of possibility. That visual storytelling really drives home one of the more interesting questions the drama keeps circling: what kind of power is worse, blatant, old-school tyranny that calls itself divine right, or the more subtle, contractual power of money, marriage, and image in the modern world? Healy has technically leveled up. She has agency, wealth, access. But a king from her past is still trying to drag her back, and in the present, she's navigating industries and institutions that still see her as expendable. Survival looks different, but it's still survival. The music deserves a shout, too. The score leans into this blend of traditional and modern. You'll hear something that sounds like an old string instrument over a beat that's unmistakably contemporary. Whenever the ruby appears or time-related dialogue comes up, there's this recurring motif, a few notes that feel slightly out of tune on purpose, like time itself is bending. It's the kind of detail you maybe don't consciously register, but your brain starts to associate that sound with something important is happening beneath the surface. There's also this unapologetically melodramatic main theme that kicks in during Healy's bigger moments, when she delivers a speech on set, when she stares down Louis, when she makes a risky move with the CEO. Is it a little much? Absolutely. Did I still get chills the first time it swelled under a close-up of her holding the ruby in one hand and a pen to sign a contract in the other? Also yes. This is not a show that is embarrassed to feel big. I do want to admit something on a personal note. Somewhere around the midpoint, there's a quiet scene where Healy is alone, lying in bed, and she's holding the ruby up against the city lights bleeding in through her window. No dialogue, just her and this tiny red stone that has outlived her once already. She looks exhausted. You can see the queen and the actress and the confused modern woman all overlapping in her expression. That scene made me tear up a little, and I wasn't expecting that. It's not a dramatic breakdown, it's not a death, it's just tiredness. The weight of having to constantly reinvent yourself in order to keep existing. That hit. I know, I'm probably reading way too much into a 30-second shot of someone staring at jewelry. But that's kind of what we do here. Welcome to Jonota News, where we psychoanalyze props. What keeps the show engaging, even when it risks spinning out of control, is that it keeps returning to Healy as its North Star. Everything, even the weird time rift plotting, is ultimately tied back to her emotional journey. Does she want revenge, or freedom? Does she want to rewrite the past, or build something in the present? Is she willing to sacrifice this new life, including the husband who might actually love her, for the chance to prevent her own murder in the past? Those are big, frankly existential questions, and the drama at least tries to wrestle with them rather than just using time travel as a flashy gimmick. That said, this is not a perfect show, and I don't want to pretend it is. There are some tonal whiplashes. You'll be watching this intense, beautifully shot argument between Healy and her husband about trust and betrayal, and then smash cut to a scene where a supporting character is cracking jokes on a film set like we're suddenly in a workplace comedy. Sometimes it works as relief, other times it feels like the editor shuffled two different shows together. One particularly jarring area is how the series sometimes treats violence. There are moments where Healy's past trauma is handled with real care, flashbacks are brief, suggestive rather than graphic, and focused on her emotional reaction. But then, Occasionally, the show will stage modern confrontations in a way that almost glamorizes the brutality, as if it forgot its own thematic stance. You'll have a brutal beatdown that's shot like a music video, and it can be dissonant after all this careful build-up about cycles of abuse. It doesn't completely undermine the message, but it does make you raise an eyebrow. Still, even in those wobblier choices, you can kind of see what the creators were reaching for. They wanted a drama that was operatic, that swung for the fences in every direction. Subtlety was never on the menu, and in a weird way, that honesty is refreshing. The show is like, we are doing reincarnated queen, CEO husband, film industry, time rifts, blood magic, all of it. Take it or leave it. And I respect the commitment. We should talk a little more about the CEO husband, because he's going to be a huge factor in whether you emotionally connect with the series. He starts off as your standard issue cold male-led, controlled, aloof, borderline rude in that contained, drama hero way where you are supposed to see the loneliness underneath. But what differentiates him, at least for me, is how the show lets him be wrong for a long time. He doesn't magically intuit that something huge has changed in his wife. For quite a while, he misreads her new boundaries as manipulation, as a phase, even as some kind of midlife crisis. That's frustrating to watch, but it also feels painfully real. When someone changes for reasons you can't see, our instinct is often to protect our own comfort, not to lean in and ask, what happened? As Healy becomes less willing to play the old role, cooking his favorite meal just because, being quiet when he's moody, being available whenever his schedule opens up, he panics in this very controlled way. He tries to bring her back into their old pattern with money, with critique, with withholding affection. It's like watching someone trying to use the remote for an old device on a brand new system. He keeps pressing the same buttons, but the code has changed. There's a really telling scene in their kitchen. It's late, they're both home, and he notices she's reading a script instead of handling some house-related task she used to take care of. He makes a small, slightly cutting comment, nothing monstrous, just one of those everyday comments that quietly puts someone down. Old wife version of her might have swallowed it. New Healy looks up, pauses, and says something like, "You have 2 hands and 2 legs. If you want it done, you are capable." The silence afterward is so heavy. You see his entire mental image of their marriage crack a little. Moments like that are where the show really earns its romance potential. It's not about grand gestures, it's about whether this man can unlearn the unspoken rules that let him coast in the relationship while she did the emotional labor. The reincarnation plot almost becomes a narrative excuse to ask, what if your partner suddenly stopped cooperating with the version of them you built in your head? Would you fight to drag them back, or would you actually meet the person in front of you now? On the acting front, the lead actress carries an insane amount of weight. She has to play Healy as a queen in the past, Healy as a soul inhabiting a modern body, Healy performing as an actress in a film, and Healy pretending to be the old version of the modern woman for people who would notice too much change. That's 4 performance layers, and most of the time, you can tell exactly which one you are seeing just from the way she walks into a room. One of my favorite little details is how her voice shifts. In Palais flashbacks, her tone is slightly lower, measured, every sentence almost complete, like she knows servants are listening. In the present, when she's alone or with someone she trusts, she lets her speech speed up, shorten, feel more lived in. Then when she's in front of cameras or reporters, she slips into this perfectly modulated, media-trained cadence that sounds a lot like the public persona of the modern woman whose life she's taken over. It's smart, subtle work that makes you believe in the premise even when the plot takes huge leaps. The actor playing Louis, especially in the modern timeline, has to walk a really dangerous line. He can't be so charming that you forget he murdered her, but he also can't be so one-note evil that you're bored every time he appears. What he mostly nails is this sense of wounded ego. There's this idea threaded through his performance that Louis genuinely believes Healy belongs to him, across time, regardless of bodies or circumstances. So when he looks at her in the present day, there's possessiveness, yes, but also this weird sense of betrayal, as if she's being disloyal simply by existing outside the narrative where he's in charge. And then there's the modern husband. His arc is more slowly brewed, which I appreciated. A lot of these cold CEO types get thawed out by like episode 4 and become fluffy marshmallows. Yeah, the shifts are incremental. A softened gaze here, a hesitant apology there, a moment of genuine fear when he realizes she might be in actual danger from this mysterious man circling her. When he finally begins to piece together that something about her past, not just recent history, is haunting her, you can see both the terror and the determination. He's not some chosen heroic protector by nature, he has to choose to show up, to grow into that role, and the actor sells that awkward growth. Every few episodes, the show does this thing where it pulls all of these threads, romance, revenge, fantasy, career, into one big sequence. Usually it's something like a major film premiere, a board meeting, or a confrontation where Louis, the CEO, and Healy are all in the same physical space. Those crossovers are messy in the best way. You can practically feel the writer's room going, okay, how do we get all three of them into this room so that everyone's motives are colliding at once? One such collision happens at a big event related to her movie. Louis shows up in his modern incarnation, watching her walk the red carpet. The CEO is at her side, playing the role of the supportive, if slightly stiff, husband. The industry's elite are circling, the cameras are flashing, and in the middle of all this spectacle, there's this invisible tug-of-war over her soul. The way the camera positions her between the two men visually, one from her past, one from her present, drives home what's at stake. Does she belong to the history that tried to kill her, or the life she's building now? When the show is firing on all cylinders like that, it's kind of exhilarating. You're not just watching a love triangle, you're watching a war between time periods, fought in designer suits and evening gowns instead of armor. Of course, the looming question through all of this is the time rift. Louis is slowly piecing together how her blood and the ruby might let him crack history open. The show feeds you information in drips, snippets of old texts, unexplained supernatural phenomena around the ruby, maybe a mysterious scholar or mystic figure who shows up to drop cryptic warnings. The exact mechanics are intentionally fuzzy, which will either intrigue you or annoy you depending on how much you like your fantasy to have clear rules. For me, the ambiguity mostly worked because the emotional clarity was there. It's not really about whether the magic system is airtight. It's about whether Healy is going to be forced into a choice, sacrifice this new life to prevent the old one's tragedy, or protect the present and let the past remain what it was. The show keeps circling that choice, coming at it from different angles through side plots and side characters, so that by the time the time rift stuff starts to peak, you understand what the choice symbolizes, even if you couldn't draw a technical diagram of how the portal works. Somewhere along the way, I realized I'd stopped watching purely for the twists and started watching to see how Healy would answer one core question. If you were given a second life, is justice for your first life worth more than the love and possibilities you've found now? And crucially, who gets to decide that, your past self or your present one? That's where I'll pause on the big picture story for a moment and circle back to the craft, because there's something else this drama does that I think is worth pointing out. It has a surprisingly good sense of when to be quiet. For a series packed with reincarnation, blood magic, and corporate intrigue, some of the strongest scenes are just two people in a room talking, no music, minimal cuts, the camera sitting still. Those quieter conversations, especially between Healy and her husband, or Healy and a trusted friend in the modern world, are where the show's writing does most of its heavy lifting. Dialogues about fear of dependency, about whether revenge actually heals anything, about what it means to move on when a part of you is still literally stuck in another era. They're not always perfectly written, but there's a sincerity there. You can feel the show trying to articulate something beyond simple catharsis. And on the flip side, when the show decides to go big, it really goes big. There are dream sequences that look like oil paintings, sequences where past and present fold into each other visually, Healy walking through a modern marketplace only for the stalls to briefly flicker into medieval vendors, that sort of thing. You might roll your eyes if you are allergic to overt symbolism, but for me, those flourishes kept reminding me we are not watching realism, we are watching a myth being retold with Wi-Fi and credit cards. If you're still with me this far into unpacking Journey of an Ancient Queen, you can probably tell this show got under my skin in a way I wasn't expecting. It's messy, yes. It overreaches, absolutely. But it also swings for themes and emotions that a lot of safer, neater dramas never even aim for. And that's the thing that really snuck up on me. I went in for the genre mashup, and somewhere in the middle I realized I was actually more invested in this one woman trying to excavate some kind of selfhood out from under centuries of other people's expectations. As the story moves into its later stretch, you can feel the pressure tightening around Healy from all directions. Her acting career is finally taking off, which should be this triumphant arc. The production she's leading becomes a hit in its own right, the press is eating her up, her name is starting to mean something beyond so-and-so's wife. But the more visible she becomes, the more dangerous it is that Lewis is circling and the time rift stuff is quietly escalating in the background. This is where the editing starts doing some really nice parallel work. You'll have a scene of Healy giving this fiery monologue on set as her character, usually about destiny or defying some cruel fate, and the show will crosscut it with Lewis uncovering another clue about the ruby, or with an old text describing a ritual that sounds uncomfortably familiar. On paper, that could be heavy-handed, but it actually creates this heartbeat rhythm between her rising star and the rising threat. You feel like every step up the ladder puts her on a taller, thinner branch. What's smart is how the drama uses smaller characters to echo different possible futures for Healy. There's a veteran actress on the film set who's been through the industry meat grinder and come out the other side, not unscathed, but pragmatic. She watches Healy throw herself into roles, fight for creative choices, burn bridges when she thinks something is unjust, and there's this mixture of admiration and dread in her eyes. In a couple of quiet conversations, she basically represents one path: you harden, you compromise, you survive, and you carry some bitterness like a permanent accessory. Then there's a younger actress, bright-eyed, just happy to be in the room. She idolizes Healy, imitates her style, stalks her socials. At first, Healy keeps her at arm's length, she's too busy trying to manage her own lives to mentor anybody. But slowly, she realizes that this girl is watching everything: how she handles misogynistic directors, how she negotiates contracts, how she reacts to scandals. That realization lands hard. Whether she likes it or not, she's becoming someone people model themselves after. That's where the show quietly nudges the question of responsibility. Healy has every right to be selfish in this life. She's owed 10 normal lifetimes of selfishness after what she went through. But what does it mean when your personal war with a centuries-old king starts warping the lives around you? When a fragile, eager newbie might get caught in the crossfire of your feud, or learn the wrong lesson from how you wield power. The series doesn't sermonize about that. It just sets up these mirrors and lets you feel the weight. There's a moment where that younger actress stumbles into something dangerous because she tries to stand up for herself the way she's seen Healy do it, without having Healy's mental armor or long-range perspective. Watching the fallout of that misstep is painful, and you can see the guilt burning in Healy's gaze even as she does the damage control. It's like the drama is saying, your survival strategies aren't neutral, people copy them. But here's where it gets tricky in a really compelling way. Lewis is also watching and learning. In the past, his power was absolute. In the present, he has to adapt. He sees how much more platform and leverage Healy has now, and he starts to understand that if he can twist that, he'll have something even more terrifying than a queen in chains, a queen who willingly uses her influence in ways that harmonize with his agenda. There's an unnerving sequence where Lewis engineers a crisis around the ruby going missing, again, not in some shadowy castle, but in the middle of a modern PR hurricane. Suddenly, Healy is dealing with tabloids, accusations of theft or fraud, questions about authenticity. The ruby is no longer just a relic, it's a controversy with hashtags. Watching her forced to talk about this object, her literal lifeline, as if it's just another item of branded content, is grimly ironic. You can almost see Lewis smirking in the subtext. This is his kind of cruelty. Reshaped for a media age. Visually, that arc is handled in a way that I really enjoyed. The once sacred ruby ends up photographed under harsh studio flashes, fingerprints all over its display case, debated on talk shows. Every time it appears on a screen within the show, the color is just a little bit wrong, too bright, too saturated, while in-person shots retain that deeper, almost blood-like crimson. It's a simple color grading trick, but it drives home the idea that the public narrative and Healy's private reality are out of sync. The more Lewis manipulates events, the more we start brushing up against the core fantasy engine of the show, that time rift. He's not just trying to open some sci-fi portal because it looks cool. For him, it's about restoring an order he believes was interrupted. In his mind, history went wrong when Healy refused to be entirely docile. The rift is his way of literally rewinding the tape to before she grew into a threat. What I appreciated is that the series doesn't suddenly turn into a puzzle box about how the time rift works. It stays focused on what the rift represents. We see recurring images, blood drops, water ripples, reflections in glass, that link the idea of time breaking with the idea of identity cracking. At certain points, Healy starts experiencing déjà vu or PTSD-like flashbacks that blur her sense of which life she's actually in. The show implies that the more Lewis messes with the barrier between eras, the more unstable her soul becomes. So when Healy is forced to confront him, really confront him, not just glimpsing him in crowds, you know there's more at stake than whether she walks away uninjured. She's risking erosion. Each interaction with him threatens to rewrite the fragile narrative she's built in the present, to pull her back into the mindset of the woman who was cornered and killed. One of the most chilling scenes in the drama, for me, is not even a violent one. It's a conversation, in a relatively public place, a cafe, a hotel lobby, somewhere ordinary. Lewis sits across from her in his modern body, and he starts casually reciting details from their royal life together. The baby they almost had. The night he first doubted her loyalty. The specific color of the dress she wore the first time she counseled him against a war. He weaponizes memory like a scalpel, trying to make her feel like she still belongs in that shared past. The whole thing is shot with these tight close-ups that occasionally slip focus, her face drifting soft while his sharpens, then vice versa. It creates this nauseating sensation that we, like her, are being tugged back and forth. And the sound design drops the background noise out, so even though you see people walking past, laughing, clinking cups, you hear nothing but his voice. It's suffocating in a way that needs no supernatural effects to sell the danger. The part that really caught me off guard, though, is that Healy doesn't respond with a big dramatic outburst. She doesn't try to one-up him with a monologue of her own. She goes still. She listens. And then, quietly, she refuses to let him narrate her life for her anymore. Without giving the exact wording away, she essentially tells him, "Those memories are mine, too. But the meaning you gave them ends here." It's not a magical spell, but it feels like one. She's reclaiming authorial control over her own history. Moments like that made me realize this show is as much about storytelling as it is about reincarnation. Lewis wants to be the narrator of her life, whether in a throne room or a skyscraper. Healy's journey is about seizing that narrative pen back, even if she can't rewrite every chapter. On the flip side, we have the CEO husband slowly waking up to the fact that his wife's inner world is much more complicated and much more dangerous than he ever imagined. For a while, he's kept at the periphery of the supernatural plot, not because the writers forgot him, but because Healy chooses not to involve him. And you can argue about that decision. Is she protecting him, or is she repeating the mistake of shouldering everything alone? But here's where the drama does something I really liked. It lets him be hurt by her secrecy without making him entitled to every part of her trauma. There's this subtle but important distinction in how their fights are written. When he finds out things, he's angry not in a "how dare you have a life before me" way, but more in a "how am I supposed to stand beside you if you won't even give me a chance" way. It straddles that line between valid feeling and romanticized overreach, and it doesn't always land perfectly, but when it does, it feels painfully human. The turning point in his arc, for me, comes when he finally witnesses something he cannot rationalize, some manifestation of the time rift or the ruby's power that shatters his modern, reasonable worldview. The show lingers on the denial stage, him trying to explain it away, wake up from it, file it under stress hallucination. But eventually, he reaches the one conclusion that actually matters. his wife has been living in a universe where this is real long before he ever knew. That realization forces him to confront just how self-centered his complaints about distance and coldness may have been. From that point on, his love shifts from, "I want the version of you who fits my life," to, "I will, however clumsily, walk into this nightmare world with you." And to me, that's where their romance finally clicks. Not in the kisses or the jealous fits, but in the scene where he's trying to help her research ancient rituals on some dusty, sketchy website at 3 in the morning, eyes burning, grasp of the supernatural still shaky at best, but staying because leaving isn't an option anymore. It's funny in a grounded way, this polished CEO in his perfect home office, doom-scrolling through occult forums like some desperate college kid before finals. I'll say something that might be slightly spicy. I actually liked him more in those awkward, "I'm clearly winging this occult support thing" moments than in the more traditionally romantic scenes. A lot of dramas make the male lead heroic by giving him perfect instincts. Journey of an Ancient Queen lets this guy be kind of bad at emotional labor and then makes him work at it. That's not as swoony on the surface as, say, a grand airport chase, but it feels more achievable, more real. So, how does all of this thread back into the show's themes? Underneath the fantasy and the spectacle, this is a story about women's bodies and lives being treated as battlegrounds for men's ambitions, and about what it might look like to refuse that role, even when the entire structure of your reality is built to force you into it. Healy's first life is a textbook case of that dynamic. Her marriage is political, her womb is seen as an extension of the kingdom, her intelligence is useful only as long as it serves Louis. When she becomes inconvenient, he literally kills her. In her second life, the battlefield shifts. Now it's her image that's commodified, by studios, by brands, by the media. The show is smart enough to draw those parallels explicitly at times. The questions she gets asked in interviews about her body, her relationships, her responsibility as a role model. They're different in tone from the court gossip of the past, but the entitlement underneath is uncomfortably familiar. Even the time rift ritual is, in a way, about men claiming ownership over a woman's blood, her literal life force, as a resource they get to harness for their purposes. Louis talks about returning what is rightfully ours, but the ours in his sentence never really includes Healy as an equal. She's the key, not the beneficiary. The show doesn't present an easy, clean answer to that problem. It doesn't end up in a place where all systemic issues are magically solved. It can't, because it's honest about how deep those roots go. What it does offer, though, are glimpses of resistance that feel believable. Healy setting boundaries with her husband and with colleagues and with fans. Healy refusing to let Louis dictate how she remembers her own past. Healy choosing, again and again, to act from a place of self-definition instead of being purely reactionary. And yeah, she stumbles. She makes choices out of anger that backfire. She sometimes uses the tools of the systems that hurt her, money, image, leverage, in ways that replicate some of their harm. The drama doesn't let her be a flawless avenging angel, and that complexity is one of the things I actually loved most. There's a version of this story where she's a pure, saintly victim in the past and a morally perfect justice machine in the present. That version would be boring. This one isn't. If I zoom out for a second, you can kind of see how Journey of an Ancient Queen is in conversation with other recent reincarnation and body swap dramas, even if unintentionally. The whole setup of someone from a hierarchical, brutal past waking up in a glossy modern setting and realizing the same power games are still being played? That's not new. But where some shows mind that purely for comedy or wish fulfillment, look, the medieval queen bought a sports car. This one leans into the discomfort. A scene that really encapsulates that is when Healy visits a modern museum exhibit featuring artifacts from her original era. She's walking through a curated version of her own life, filtered through academic texts and audio guides. We see paintings of a queen who looks like her but whose caption erases her influence, calls her controversial, hints at rumors we know were exaggerated to justify her downfall. Schoolkids are taking selfies with a portrait of her murderer. It's surreal and kind of heartbreaking. She stands there listening to a tour guide talk about Queen Healy's suspected treachery against her husband, the noble King Louis, and you can just see the rage simmering under her skin. Even history has been weaponized against her. It's not enough that she died, the story after her death was twisted to frame her as the villain. That moment does more to sell the horror of historical erasure than any amount of shouting matches with Louis, honestly. And the irony is painful, she's finally in a position to reshape narratives as an actress, as a public figure in the modern world, but the story of her first life has been already written and fossilized. The time rift, in that light, becomes more than a portal, it's a temptation. If she could go back and correct the record, prevent the betrayal, would that be worth risking everything she's gained? The show flirts with that temptation just enough to make you sweat before stepping back. It throws out questions like, if you could warn your past self, should you? Would you even be the same person now if you hadn't endured what you did then? Is survival at any cost always the goal, or is there a point where letting a version of yourself die is the most merciful thing you can do? I'm obviously being vague about the exact way those questions resolve, because this isn't a step-by-step plot breakdown. But I'll say that journey of an ancient queen doesn't cop out with a purely rosy answer. There's sacrifice involved. There's loss that can't be undone. The show respects the fact that some wounds don't get fairy tale fixes, even when you introduce magical rubies and time fractures. Let's double back to the production side for a moment, because I've been talking a lot about themes and characters and less about how the show actually looks and feels episode to episode. From a pure craftsmanship standpoint, this is a drama that knows how to fill a frame. The medieval sets are detailed without being cluttered. You get the sense of lived-in royalty, worn steps on palace staircases, chipped paint under new gilding, tapestries that have clearly weathered more than one generation of smoke. It avoids the plastic sheen that some period dramas fall into, where everything looks like it was purchased from the medieval section of a party store yesterday. When you see Healy sitting in front of a mirror being dressed by maids, the table is crowded with oils and combs and unglamorous little tools of maintenance. You believe this is a place where people really live, not just pose. In the modern world, the production design goes for a sleek, aspirational look, penthouse apartments with panoramic city views, ultra-contemporary office spaces, minimalist cafes. But within that shininess, the show sprinkles these small, humanizing touches, a plant slowly dying on a windowsill, a quote forever forgotten on the back of a chair, script pages scattered messily on a glass coffee table. It's those details that stop the visuals from becoming generic stock photo luxury and ground them in character. Cinematography-wise, there's a clear visual language around control and loss of control. Early on, scenes with Louis often use low-angle shots, making him loom. Healy, in those same spaces, is seen in three-quarter frames, partially obscured by pillars or furniture, as if the world is constantly slicing her into pieces. In the modern world, when she's on set or in front of cameras, the framing is dead-on, head-to-toe, powerful. When she feels vulnerable, alone at home, dealing with nightmares, the camera moves closer, sometimes uncomfortably so, cropping parts of her face to mimic the feeling of being trapped in your own head. The editing rhythm matches that intent. Political or corporate machinations get cut quickly, a lot of reaction shots, glances, half-heard whispers. Emotional conversations linger, with takes that stretch just a bit longer than is comfortable, forcing you to sit in the awkwardness. Action sequences, like the beatdown of the bully early on or later confrontations, avoid that hyper-edited, can't-tell-what's-happening style. Instead, they use medium shots, letting you register bodies and movement and impact. It's not groundbreakingly innovative, but it's competent, and competence goes a long way when you are juggling this much narrative. Sound design also deserves credit beyond just the music. The show uses silence very intentionally. There are scenes where the absence of a score is almost louder than any musical cue could be. The moment before Healy makes a significant choice, or the second after someone delivers a line that changes a relationship, no swell, just room tone, breathing, maybe a faint hum of city noise. In a drama that can sometimes be operatic, those pauses feel like deep breaths before plunges. I should also mention how the show handles humor, because with a premise this heavy, you need levity. Thankfully, most of the lighter moments land. Once Healy gets a bit more comfortable with modern life, she develops this deadpan wit that plays beautifully against the more extra personalities around her. There's a running bit where she keeps unintentionally using very formal, archaic turns of phrase in casual situations, talking to an Uber driver like he's a royal carriage man, for example, and people just chalk it up to her method acting. Sometimes, she leans into that misunderstanding on purpose, milking it for boundaries. When a nosy reporter asks a deeply invasive question, she responds with this icily polite, almost regal dismissal that leaves the entire press line stunned into silence. It's funny, but it's also a character choice. She's finally figured out how to weaponize the persona they think she has. If I'm being honest, there are jokes that don't fully land. A couple of the sidekick characters exist mainly for comic relief and can feel a bit cartoonish compared to the groundedness of Healy's emotional journey. But overall, the humor feels like a pressure valve, not an undercutting of the drama. At this point, if you are wondering, okay, but is the ride actually satisfying? The answer for me is yes, with caveats. The narrative does come together. The time rift thread and the marriage arc and the career storyline all crash into each other in a way that feels earned. Some questions remain deliberately murky, especially around the metaphysics of souls and cause and effect across time, but the big emotional depths get paid. What I think sets Journey of an Ancient Queen apart from a lot of similarly wild premise dramas is that it doesn't treat its concept as a cheap hook. It actually keeps digging into the implications. The show asks, over and over, if you knew how your story ended once, would that make you more cautious the second time, or more reckless? If your worst abuser refused to stay in the past, how would you build safety in a world where history can literally walk in the door? And what does love even look like, in that context? Because love is the other pillar of this drama, messy, scarred, stubborn love. Not just romantic love between Healy and her husband, but also self-love in the most uncringy sense of that phrase. Love as in, I will not give up on the possibility that my life can be about more than what was done to me. If you've ever watched a drama and gotten frustrated because the female lead seems to forgive unforgivable things too easily, or because her pain is used as seasoning for someone else's growth, this show will probably feel cathartic. Not because Healy is perfectly empowered all the time, she's not, but because the narrative is firmly on her side. Even when she makes mistakes, the show never implies she deserved what happened to her in the past. It never romanticizes Lewis. It can explore the complexity of his psychology without asking us to root for his redemption. I know that's going to be a relief for a lot of viewers who are tired of the Batman made soft by love cycle. Lewis doesn't get that arc. His soul crossing over into the future isn't framed as a chance for him to become better, it's framed as a continuation of the same danger. The question becomes not, can he change, but can he be stopped from rewriting this woman's life a second time? And somewhere in that battle, the CEO husband becomes less of a genre archetype and more of a partner auditioning for the role of actual ally. The show doesn't hand him a gold star for basic decency. It lets him screw up, be defensive, be slow to understand. Then it lets us see whether he learns. For me, watching him evolve from someone who unintentionally benefits from patriarchal dynamics into someone who actively challenges them, even just within their household, was more satisfying than any of the fantasy fireworks. So, where does all of this leave us in terms of recommendation? I'll get to a clean verdict later, but I think it's already clear, Journey of an Ancient Queen is not a casual background watch. It's emotionally dense, occasionally overplotted, sometimes messy in tone. But if you're the kind of viewer who likes your melodrama laced with genuine questions about power, trauma, and second chances, there's a lot here to sink your teeth into. And honestly, if you've ever daydreamed about going back to confront the people who hurt you with the full strength of who you've become since, this show is going to scratch that itch in ways that might surprise you. I want to zoom in a bit on how the show actually structures all of this. Because the way Journey of an Ancient Queen rolls out its plot has a big impact on how you experience it. The early episodes are very front-loaded with the medieval material. You get just enough time in that world to understand Healy's reality before the reincarnation happens. That's a smart choice. If they'd rushed through her first life, her obsession with the ruby and her terror of Lewis wouldn't land as hard. but they also don't linger there forever. By the time you are starting to get used to the rhythm of court intrigue, they yank you into fluorescent-lit modernity. It's a whiplash on purpose, and it kind of mirrors what Healy is going through. She's just barely figured out how to survive in one system, and suddenly she's dropped into another. Once we're in the present, the show settles into a different pattern. Each arc tends to braid 3 strands together. You've usually got a career thread, audition, shoot, premiere, a domestic thread, some new development with the CEO husband, or the fallout of a previous argument, and a supernatural thread, visions, Louis moving a piece on the time rift chessboard, the Ruby behaving weirdly. Sometimes a bully justice beat or a side character subplot gets woven in as a 4th strand, but those 3 are the backbone. What that means in practice is that the pacing can feel dense but not necessarily fast. Scenes have to do double or triple duty. A dinner at home might start as a romantic reconciliation attempt, morph into a power struggle over who controls information, and end on a shot of the Ruby glowing faintly in Healy's jewelry box when no one is looking. If you are half watching while scrolling on your phone, you are going to miss a lot of those layered signals. But here's where it gets interesting. That density lets the show set up payoffs that feel really satisfying later, because it's been planting little thematic and visual seeds everywhere. One example, early in her acting career arc, Healy has to film a scene where her character kneels in front of a man who holds her fate in his hands. The director wants tears, wants visible fear. Healy, still raw from her own history, initially refuses to play it the way they're asking. She chooses a different approach. Her character kneels, but instead of sobbing, she remains eerily calm. She looks up through her lashes with this measured, almost calculating stare. It unsettles the crew. There's a little conflict about authenticity versus market expectations. On the surface, it's about creative choices. That scene doesn't fully pay off until much later, when history threatens to repeat itself in a very different context. Healy is again in a position where someone, let's just say a powerful man who thinks he owns time now, is trying to force her into a posture of submission. The show echoes the same physical setup, her lowered body, his looming presence. Except this time, she's not delivering a performance for a camera, she's making a decision in real life. The memory of that earlier filmed scene overlays in your brain, and the choice she makes now, in how she speaks, whether she kneels or not, what she does with her gaze, hits so much harder because we've seen her wrestle with what authentic fear and performed fear look like. These kinds of rhymes are where you can feel the writers really thinking in arcs rather than just episode-by-episode shock value. The series wants you to feel like Healy is in conversation with her own story across time, both fictional and real. That said, there is a middle stretch where the show sags a bit. Somewhere between, Healy gets her big break as a lead, and Louis fully reveals his ambitions with the time rift, the narrative kind of lingers in a holding pattern. We get a few too many scenes of ominous glances, mysterious texts, and people half telling each other the truth. You start to sense the script stalling, buying time before the endgame mechanics really kick in. I will say, though, even in that slower section, the character work often saves it. There's a lovely, small domestic sequence where Healy and the CEO end up stuck in their apartment during a storm, power out, phones dying. No work, no cameras, no obligations. Just two people in the dark with candles, which is a deliberate visual callback to the medieval era. The conversation they have in that space, about what they wanted when they were younger, about what security means to each of them, does more to build their intimacy than some of the big, showy gestures earlier. It's one of those moments where the drama lets them be people rather than tropes. And then, just when you think, okay, this is nice, but we need more plot, the storm outside cracks open a supernatural beat. A flash of lightning, a moment where the city lights flicker in a way that doesn't match the weather. Healy briefly sees the silhouette of a castle instead of another skyscraper. It's like time hiccups for a second. That's the show's pacing trick in a nutshell, lull you with small human stuff, then puncture the calm with this unnerving reminder that the universe itself is not stable for her. I want to touch on some of the secondary characters because they're a big part of what makes the world feel full rather than just a stage for the big three, Healy, Louis, CEO husband. The bully we mentioned earlier, for instance, is not a one-episode villain. After their initial confrontation, she doesn't just disappear into the void of people who have been taught a lesson. The show actually spends some time on the consequences of that beatdown, both legally and socially. There's an internal investigation at the company, rumors on social media, shifts in workplace loyalty. The bully tries, at first, to reassert her dominance using the new tools of public victimhood. She frames herself as the injured party, circulates a very edited story about what happened. What's fascinating here is that the drama doesn't let that version wholly triumph, but it also doesn't paint it as completely powerless. Some people believe her. Some people are tired of powerful women tearing each other down and lump both of them into the same problematic box. Watching Healy navigate that minefield is painful but compelling, because it shows that in the modern arena, image battles can be just as vicious as sword fights were in the past. My slightly surprising take on this subplot is that I actually appreciated how long the show lingered on the aftermath. I've seen some viewers complain that it drags, that we don't care enough about the bully's perspective to warrant that much runtime. I get that sentiment, but I think if they'd wrapped it up in one triumphant episode, it would have rung false. Real life doesn't hand you clean victories over deeply entrenched bullies. There are HR meetings. There are whisper campaigns. There are people who quietly distance themselves from you because you are now too much drama. The drama choosing to dramatize that messiness made the catharsis we did get earlier feel more expensive, which I liked. On the friend side, Healy does eventually build a small, makeshift family around her in the present, a manager in the industry who starts out self-serving but grows a conscience, that veteran actress I mentioned, maybe a sibling or cousin who grounds her with some non-showbiz perspective. These characters are written with varying degrees of depth, but the best of them serve as moral checks. When Healy's vengeance instinct goes too far, or when she starts to treat people as pawns the way Louis did, they're the ones who push back, sometimes gently, sometimes not. There's one particularly sharp conversation between Healy and her manager after she pulls a publicity stunt that puts someone else at risk. The manager calls her out, saying something along the lines of, "You are borrowing the same tactics they used on you. Are you okay with becoming that?" Healy bristles, deflects, but you can tell the words land. That scene matters because it prevents the show from slipping into pure revenge fantasizing. It keeps asking, what does justice look like without turning you into a mirror of your oppressors? Speaking of justice, let's talk about Louis' endgame a bit more without going into step-by-step spoilers. As he gets closer to actualizing the time rift, the show starts dipping into more overt fantasy. We see glimpses of phenomena that scare even him, a tear in reality that doesn't behave the way he expects, temporal echoes that pull random bystanders into flash visions of the past. That escalation is crucial, because it frames him as someone who thinks he's in control of forces that are, in fact, way beyond him. One of the most memorable sequences in that vein involves a kind of time fever sweeping through a small radius around the Ruby. People in that area start experiencing brief overlaps with the medieval era. A barista sees a ghostly overlay of a palace kitchen over her cafe counter. A child points at an empty corner and insists there's a lady in a crown, crying. It's eerie, and it drives home that Louis' obsession isn't just a private matter between him and Healy anymore. He's literally destabilizing other people's reality. Those episodes might be divisive, though. If you came for the reincarnation romance and modern revenge, the sudden brush with almost horror-tinged fantasy could feel like too much. Personally, I liked the audacity of it. The show is basically saying, no, we meant it when we said time itself was on the line. It also visually cracks the bubble around Healy's trauma. For once, other people are forced to see that something is cosmically wrong, not just, she's being dramatic. One aspect I haven't talked about yet is how the drama uses costume design as another storytelling tool. In the medieval timeline, Healy's outfits are predictably elaborate, brocade, heavy jewelry, structured silhouettes. At first glance, that just seems like standard period drama fare. But pay attention to how the designs change as her position in court becomes more precarious. Early on, her gowns are wide, imposing, they take up physical space. Later, as Louis' paranoia grows, her bodices get tighter, her sleeves narrower, her necklines higher, almost like she's being physically restrained by the clothes themselves. In the modern world, her wardrobe arc is subtler but just as meaningful. The woman whose body she inhabits had a particular style, maybe very polished, very curated to appeal to a certain demographic. At first, Healy just wears what's in the closet, which makes for some fun fish-out-of-water side gags. But as she asserts herself, her clothing starts to reflect a hybrid identity. She favors strong, clean lines and structured pieces that echo her royal past, but in more breathable, contemporary fabrics. There's a point where she shows up to a board meeting in a suit that looks uncannily like modern armor, sharp shoulders, deep red blouse beneath. It's not subtle, but it's effective. Costume also plays into the symbolism of the ruby, obviously. Whenever she's wearing it openly, her outfits are usually monochrome or muted. The gem becomes the focal point, visually anchoring the entire frame. When she hides it, tucked under a shirt, in a pocket, the surrounding colors get louder and more diverse, as if her life blooms when she's not weighted down by that single burning point of history. Little things like that are why I say this show is more thoughtful in its craft than the chaotic premise might suggest. One of my favorite little visual motifs, actually, involves mirrors. In the palace, Healy's reflection is often fragmented, seen in pieces across multiple small mirrors, or blurred in polished metal that never quite shows her true face. In the modern world, mirrors are everywhere, but they're often tied to her job as an actress, in makeup rooms, on set, in shop windows where her own promotional posters stare back at her. The question becomes, which reflection is the real her, and which is performance? The drama doesn't answer that outright, but it keeps asking by placing her in front of mirror after mirror, era after era. I want to throw in a quick aside here, because this is the kind of thing that made me pause the show and just sit for a second. There's a later episode where Healy is rehearsing a scene alone in front of a bathroom mirror, no makeup, just under harsh white lighting. She's mouthing lines about a character who refuses to forgive someone who wronged her. She stops, looks at herself, and you can tell she's no longer seeing the fictional character. She's seeing the queen who died. I swear, I sat there at like 1:47 a.m. thinking, am I over-identifying with a woman arguing with her reflection from two different centuries? Possibly. But that's the fun of these deep dives, right? All of this praise doesn't mean I'm blind to the show's flaws. There are some. The late introduction of certain plot mechanics around the time rift could feel like Deus ex machina to some viewers, even if the thematic groundwork is there. A particular side character, someone loosely tied to mystical knowledge, has big, exposition dump energy at times. You can almost see the writers wheeling them out when they need to explain a new rule or limitation. While the actor does what they can, those scenes occasionally break immersion. The series also occasionally fumbles tone when it comes to its portrayal of fandom and media. At first, the commentary feels sharp, critics cherry-picking quotes out of context, fans overstepping boundaries, the public flipping from adoration to condemnation on a dime. But as we get closer to the end, some of that critique gets a bit muddled. There's a subplot involving a devoted fan who takes things too far, classic stalker territory, and the resolution of that storyline is a little too neat for my taste. Given how nuanced the show is elsewhere, that felt like a missed opportunity to really interrogate parasocial dynamics. Let's talk acting one more time, but from a different angle, chemistry. This is a reincarnation romance of sorts, but also a reincarnation thriller and a career drama. That's a lot of tones to juggle between actors, and not every pairing works equally well. Healy and the CEO husband have slow burn chemistry. It's not fireworks from episode 1, it's more like embers that you slowly realize are warming the whole room. They read more like an old married couple who accidentally skipped the actually talk about our feelings step and now have to go back and retrofit intimacy. By the time they reach their later, more vulnerable conversations, that foundation pays off. You believe that they have years of shared history, good and bad, underneath the surface, even though we only ever see the tail end of it. Healy and Louis, on the other hand, have what I would call negative chemistry, and I mean that as a compliment. The actors create this crackling tension that never tips into romanticization, which is hard to pull off. You feel the pull, not attraction, but gravitational history. When they share the screen, you are not thinking, oh, the bad boy, maybe he can change. You are thinking, this is a black hole she barely escaped, and it's trying to swallow her again. That distinction matters, and the performers absolutely sell it. Chemistry with the supporting cast is more hit or miss. The veteran actress and Healy have a wonderful, almost mentor-mentee vibe that feels lived in. The younger actress brings a fresh, slightly chaotic energy that plays well off Healy's composed intensity. A comic relief assistant character, though, sometimes feels imported from a lighter workplace rom-com and can be jarring in more dramatic episodes. None of it is enough to break the show, but you can feel the tonal seams. So, who is Journey of an Ancient Queen actually for? I think if you're someone who needs your fantasy premises to be tightly logical, your romances to be light and cute, or your revenge plots to be unambiguous and consequence-free, this might not be your show. It asks a lot of you: emotional patience, willingness to suspend disbelief in a softer, mythic way instead of in a hard sci-fi way, tolerance for characters making morally grey choices. But if you like dramas that feel a bit like cracked fairy tales, if you are into reincarnation as a lens on generational trauma, if you like watching a female-led systematically renegotiate every relationship in her life on her own terms, if you don't mind yelling at the screen sometimes when characters make frustratingly human mistakes, there's a very good chance this is going to lodge itself in your brain. From a purely entertainment perspective, the show is addictive. The cliffhangers are engineered to make you hit next episode even when you know you should probably go to sleep. It's not just twisty for shock's sake, it's twisty in the sense that each turn forces you to reevaluate what you thought you knew about someone's motives. Even minor characters reveal hidden depths or switching allegiances in ways that make the world feel alive. That addictiveness does come with the usual risk: emotional burnout. There were definitely moments, for me, where I had to pause and take a break, not because the show was bad, but because it was a lot. Watching someone repeatedly face down echoes of their own murder, navigate betrayal, juggle fame and danger and love, it's intense. If you are sensitive to depictions of psychological manipulation or domestic power imbalances, you might want to pace yourself, even though the fantasy dressing can make it feel removed at first glance. We are at a point now where it makes sense to start zooming out and asking, did the show stick the landing? I won't spell out the exact final moves, but I'll say this: the resolution we get is bittersweet rather than purely triumphant. Not every villain is destroyed, not every wound is healed, but the central question, whether Healy gets to define her own story in this life, is answered in a way that felt emotionally right to me. I really appreciated that the show resisted the urge to make the time rift into a giant, CGI-laden light show that overshadows the human stakes. The climactic sequences involving that phenomenon are tense and visually striking, but they always come back to a small, human choice: who steps through, who stays, what they're willing to forget or remember. The special effects are there to frame that moment, not replace it. The final episodes also pay off some of those visual motifs we talked about earlier. Mirrors, costumes, the ruby's glow, the way the city looks at night, all of those elements come back in altered forms, signaling that the cycle has shifted even if the wheel is still turning. It gives you that satisfying sense of narrative symmetry without feeling like the show is patting itself on the back. Emotionally, the ending left me in that weird, good place where I couldn't immediately start another show. I had to sit with it. There's grief baked into it, but also a quiet kind of hope. Not the grand, triumphant hope of everything is perfect now, but the stubborn, everyday kind of hope that says, we survived. We are going to keep choosing each other, even though the world is still dangerous. So, where do I land overall with Journey of an Ancient Queen? For me, this is a drama that I genuinely loved, even while acknowledging that it is not streamlined, not chill, and not for every mood. It's ambitious in a way that occasionally overreaches, but I would much rather watch something that aims high and stumbles a bit than something that plays it safe and evaporates from my memory the second the credits roll. If you are a newcomer to this kind of genre mashup, I'd say go in with an open mind and be patient with the early world building. Don't expect hard sci-fi rules or a tidy little rom-com. Expect melodrama, myth, trauma, and a woman who refuses to stay dead in any sense of the word. If you are more of a critic-minded viewer, there's a lot to chew on in terms of structure, visual storytelling, and thematic consistency. You could write an entire essay just on how the show treats the idea of performance, or on how it frames the difference between being watched in the palace and being watched on screen. If you are here primarily for romance, I still think there's something satisfying in Healy's relationship with the CEO husband, but it's a slower burn and more emotionally tangled than a lot of swoony fare. The payoff is less, he buys her a building, and more, he learns to sit with her pain without making it about him, which, personally, I'll take. And if you're the type who loves revenge stories, you'll get your cathartic moments, but you'll also be asked to think about what comes after the punch, after the takedown, after the public humiliation. The show doesn't completely deconstruct the revenge fantasy, but it complicates it enough that it lingers. At the end of the day, Journey of an Ancient Queen is about a woman who refuses to let her story be a cautionary tale written by the men who destroyed her. It's about the terrifying possibility that the past can follow you, and the radical act of saying, even so, I'll write something new. If that resonates with you even a little, I think it's worth giving this drama a shot. And if you've already seen it, I'd love to know how you felt about that blend of reincarnation fantasy and very grounded emotional stakes. Did the time rift stuff work for you, or did you prefer the industry and marriage angels more? Either way, thanks for hanging out with me for this deep dive. If you enjoy these kinds of long, slightly unhinged breakdowns where we treat dramas like they're literature and therapy at the same time, go ahead and hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Jonota News so you don't miss whatever wild show we tackle next. Until then, take care of yourselves, guard your own story like it's a priceless ruby, and I'll see you in the next one.